everyone, this is Addicron Podfic, back with another podfic. Today I will finally be starting The Coral Palace by I Did It for the Lol. I got this request so long ago, and I am sad that I'm sorry that I didn't get to it sooner, because I finished it a while ago, but I had other stuff that I was planning to do. And I would have started it last week, but there was that whole error where it didn't upload the video, so yeah, that happened. Anyway, let's get right into the summary. Percy's just trying to live the most peaceful life he can. He got into New Rome University, met a few of his godly siblings along the way, and is about to finish his freshman year of college when he meets a new godly sister of his, one who was once a demigod. Percy learns to find his footing with these new godly visits, and quickly realizes his newfound undersea family is more determined to make him part of Atlantis than he originally thought. In the meantime, something far from Atlantis is stirring, and Percy has this strange feeling he'll end up having to face it. Let's get right into Chapter 1, New Rome U. Percy Jackson felt like he didn't ask for a lot in his short life, but a peaceful few years was one of them. Despite that, they had yet to hear of another Despite that they had yet to hear of another prophecy, another quest, more monsters, gods, etc., everything felt as though his hard work in his second semester of college was about to go right out the window. New Rome was a safe haven. The gods left demigods and mortal legacies alike alone there to learn and grow. Percy had requested as much after the giant war that had ended nearly 2 years ago, allowing Camp Half-Blood and Camp Jupiter to go largely untouched from godly intervention. Well, mostly free of divine intervention and interaction. Percy had also held them to their promise from after the Titan War of interacting more with their children, aka what the campus had been calling Percy-mandated visitation. It had been going better than Percy had originally expected. Apollo and Hermes had taken his advice most to heart and spent several days a month at the camps, teaching their children the ways their powers manifested. Apollo helped Will learn more about his healing abilities, and together they had managed to renovate the infirmary to be top-notch. State-of-the-art equipment layered the facility, and Apollo had blessed his children with an endless supply of nectar and ambrosia that appeared in cabinets in the infirmary, restocking itself when supplies dwindled. Hermes, perhaps still feeling an incredible amount of guilt from Luke, had helped his children and campers in his cabin renovate the place to be more suitable. There were now 2 sections to the cabin. The Hermes camper side, for claimed children, had enough room for each camper to have their own bunk instead of storage cabinets. The unclaimed side was very similar, though with the glaring difference that all the gods' symbols helped to decorate the walls. It was smaller as there were less kids staying there long term, as the gods were doing much better about claiming their children. From the outside, it still appeared like a large summer camp cabin, but on the inside, when you first entered, a large marble fountain of Hermes' codices, water bubbling from the mouths of the 2 snakes and falling into a basin that overflowed and splashed against an eternal flame that campers could provide offerings to and pray at for advice. Marble benches surrounded the hearth, while vines climbed upwards from the base of the seats. Around the outside of the basin was embezzled with celestial bronze, the designs laying images of demigod heroes of old pursuing their feats of bravery. Hestia frequented here, calming campers that came to the hearth in distress and reassuring them in times of need. Percy often went to visit with her and spent a lot of time speaking with younger demigods who found comfort there. Overall, the past few years had been somewhat peaceful. Percy himself had been given the opportunity to meet his godly family and had visited his father's palace in Atlantis. His relationship with his stepmother had surprised him, as she had first approached him and apologized for her previous behavior. She claimed she did not wish to be like the Queen of the Gods, and hoped to help him in any way she could. Triton had taken more time to come around, and had simply ignored him for a large portion. He had finally warmed up to Percy after beginning to tutor him in sword fighting. Percy fought like an animal, Triton had proclaimed, with no solid structure or form. He had taken up the mantle himself, insisted he personally had to oversee Percy's retraining. It wasn't until Percy had been injured during a training match against an Atlantean warrior that he was sure Triton ever cared for him. Triton had seen him bleeding, a slip of the sword had sliced Percy's stomach open, and flown into a panic. It was after he had been rushed to the healers that Amphitrite had told him the story of Pallas and how badly that had damaged Triton's relationship with his younger siblings. "He is afraid of loving you only to lose you, Percy," Amphitrite had told him. From then on, Triton and Percy had gotten along much better. They still argued and bickered, but Triton had also realized that despite being his father's favorite son, Percy Jackson had no desire for power. He had also met a slew of his other siblings, including the main pillars of the royal family. Rhoda was kind and gentle, offering to tutor him during senior year in order to allow him to keep up with all the missing schoolwork he had. It was likely because of her that Percy had managed to graduate at all. Metisachyme came next. She was calm and peaceful like Rhoda, though much more distant in her nature. She was the goddess of waves, and therefore went wherever they chose to take her. She had appeared one day when Percy had taken Estelle to the beach for some sibling bonding, but the Sakheim had demanded she participate in the building of sandcastles, and had plopped down next to the giggling Estelle, who had looked overjoyed to have more hands to build her sandcastle, which very quickly became a sand mansion. Percy had at first been worried about this attention from his siblings, confessing to Annabeth that he feared soon they would start asking and demanding things from him, such as quests or errands to be run. As the months went on, he realized they truly desired nothing but his time. Poseidon had made it clear to the council that Percy was to be left alone in peace during his time at school. The Olympians had grumbled and moaned about but ultimately conceded that perhaps the demigods needed a break. No quests had been given since the giants had risen with Gaia, besides searchers occasionally being sent off to find demigods in distress. Which begins us today. Freshman year was going off fairly well. A few minor monster attacks when Percy left the safety of New Rome to explore the cities and coastline of California. However, mostly he was left in peace. Relative peace, anyways, as Annabeth and Rode had co-conspired to create a rigid study plan for Percy. He had huffed originally, muttering something along the lines, what was that about the sea not liking to be restrained? But had fallen to the pleading eyes of his girlfriend. Seaweed brain, you need to have good grades if you want to get into a good marine biology program, Annabeth had said. He begrudgingly admitted that she was right, and his grades had been on a good incline. So they were in the library for their scheduled Thursday study time. Neither of them had afternoon classes Tuesdays or Thursdays, so after meeting for lunch, they would head off to the library. Frank and Hazel often met up with them when they could. However, being praetors meant that they were kept very busy. They also were attempting to finish high school. Hazel finishing her junior year and Frank finally in his last semester before graduation and would be attending New Rome University for his freshman year of college that following fall. The library of New Rome University was incredible, even Percy had to admit. The exterior was polished marble and stone, imperial gold embellishments lining the edges of the roof. Latin words sprawled across the front of the steps, labeling the building as Nocturna Terram, which translated roughly to learning grounds. After walking up the steps and through the stained oak doors, you entered the main foyer. Nymphs acted as librarians and sat behind a large oak desk with large computers for the new and improved database system. There was also an older wooden chest that Percy had learned held a catalog of older books they could not digitalize due to their magical nature. If you looked past the desk and into the library itself, you would feel as though you were entering a Harry Potter movie. Books flew across the room and back onto the shelves, courtesy of small wind spirits who helped out the nymphs with certain duties. Students hunched over dozens of large oak tables. Books, laptops, and notes were spread across the tabletops as students studied independently or together. Bookshelves towered around them, rearranging themselves occasionally. If you kept your eyes moving upwards, you would notice that these bookshelves expanded all the way to the ceiling, which was painted with myths of old similar to how the Sistine Chapel had been. Apparently Michelangelo had been a child of Apollo, and his ghost had been summoned and commissioned to recreate his masterpiece with references to his own history rather than that of the Old Testament. The library was 4 floors high, and each was unique in its own aspect. The first floor was the main study hall, filled with long tables and benches where students could gather together and talk freely to study. Whiteboards littered the floor with drawings and charts from all manner of classes. Tutors wandered the floor, offering their help when needed. The second, third, and fourth floors were wrapped around the center of bookshelves that rose clear to the ceiling, and were lined with large oak banisters, painstakingly carved with laurel wreaths and vines along the woodwork. The second floor was a private group study floor. Dozens of small rooms with glass walls and doors lined the interior aspect of the floor. Tables, chairs, and a small television hung in each room, allowing for groups to work on projects in relative private without having to worry about making too much noise. The third floor was the quiet floor. Dozens of single-seat desks with their own charging ports, lamps, and privacy screens were scattered in haphazard rows across the floor. There were also several types of large chairs and cushions in one section of the third floor for those who had difficulty remaining in one place for long. The fourth floor was a bit of a mystery for the undergraduate students, as they were not permitted to go up there. It was dark and quiet, and while the second and third floors had balconies that overlooked the foyer and bookshelves, the fourth floor was walled off to the outside. During orientation, they had asked why it was closed to most students, and were informed that those were magical texts that could only be opened with the permission of the gods that had donated them to the library in the first place. Usually this included graduate or PhD candidates working on their thesis. However, the rest of the library was so thorough it wasn't often someone found their way up there. Despite not being the most keen academic, Percy had managed to find comfort in this library. As they walked in that day, Percy frowned. Something felt off. There was a feeling in the pit of his stomach, similar to anticipation. His brow furrowed as he wondered what that could possibly mean for how today's study session was going to go for him. Sometimes Percy had noticed himself feeling more in sync with the sea and its emotions. A few months back, he had woken up incredibly irritable while at Camp Half-Blood for winter break, and had challenged Clarice, of all people, to a sparring match. A few hours later, the source of his foul mood had been revealed when the sea itself, as an unseasonal hurricane, had barreled towards the Gulf of Mexico. After a few hours of bribing the local sea life, a friendly great white had been keen to tell him the reasons for his father's rage. Apparently one of Percy's sisters, a nymph who had only recently come of age at 150, as nymphs age significantly slower than regular mortals, had been offered a proposal for marriage, and his father had not known about it prior to the offer being sent. Lord Poseidon does not take kindly to those who would impose themselves on his children without their agreement, little lord. The shark, named Greg for some unknown reason, had chortled to him. Apparently not only had Percy's dad not known of the attempted proposal, he furthermore had named all of his immortal daughters off limits until they decided to seek a spouse. Because this nymph had not given her permission, she had run to Poseidon and asked him to not allow them to make her the merman's bride. After hearing of this, the Lord of Horses had unveiled one hell of a smiting on several members of the court who had attempted to help set up proposal arrangements for the merman. Annabeth was walking in front of him, discussing her intro to architecture class she had been working on a project for. She looked beautiful today in a purple New Rome University t-shirt and a pair of ripped jeans. Her black Converse tracked along towards the stairs as she had reserved a spot on the second floor so they could work on a presentation she was giving next week for said class. And afterwards, we have time to go over your biology stuff before we go train with the Legion tomorrow, because we won't have time then, and I know your exam is next week. Annabeth finished. Percy let out a small, not noticing he was hardly paying attention. His brow furrowed as the feeling somewhat intensified. Annabeth turned to the sound, concern lacing her tone. "What's wrong?" she asked, as her eyes met his frown. Her eyes glanced from side to side, surveying the room for danger, and her hand fell to her hip where he knew she kept a small backup dagger on her person. Dragonbone swords are a bit difficult to carry around freely, even at New Rome U. Percy shook his head and pursed his lips before answering. "I think maybe my dad's upset about something, or preparing for something he doesn't want to do," he said, and couldn't help but shift his eyes towards the direction of the sea. He couldn't see it inside of the library, but he knew exactly where it was and how long it would take him to get there if need be. Annabeth followed his gaze, grabbing his hand. "Hey, if it was anything serious, your siblings likely would have told you. You know that," Annabeth murmured, moving closer to him. Percy let his eyes rest on her hand and his, heart feeling lighter for a moment before returning her worried gaze. He forced himself to relax, dropping their clasped hands to his side and smiling at his girlfriend. "You're right, wise girl," he said. He sighed. "Well then, before an earthquake disrupts our time, let's go study for this stupid biology test. I'll bribe the fish for an answer later if it doesn't calm down." He laughed. Annabeth relaxed as well, walking with him towards the stairs. Right as he was about to let go of those feelings of dread entirely, when a voice rang out across the foyer. "Perseus Jackson!" a shrill voice called. Percy froze, reaching for Riptide in his pocket. Annabeth nudged him, and he met her gaze. She pointed towards the desk, and Percy relaxed once more, realizing it was one of the librarians behind the desk. Her long, dark hair was braided down her back, and she wore a classic outfit of a gray cardigan and black slacks. Large glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, and she gazed over them at Percy. She brought one hand and waved him over before disappearing behind the desk. Yes?" Percy asked, approaching the desk cautiously. Did he forget to return a book he had checked out? Annabeth was usually pretty on top of what library books they did have, and was a stickler about returning them on time, so he didn't think that was it. After a few more moments, the librarian's head returned from the filing cabinet under her desk, and she gazed at him with bright blue eyes. The name tag on her shirt said Nora. She pulled a card that looked as though it was 1,000 years old from the filing cabinet and reached over the desk to hand it to him. "The book requested for you is ready." Percy reached out hesitantly and took the card from her hands. Despite looking ancient, the card read in sea-green ink that slightly glowed, "Atlantean History, a Beginner's Guide," in plain English letters. Percy raised an eyebrow at it, looking up at Nora with a puzzled expression. I didn't request this," Percy said slowly. Nora rolled her eyes and sighted him. Annabeth was inspecting the card in Percy's hand with scrutiny, but she too seemed puzzled by it. "It was requested for you. I don't know by whom, but I was told when you come in to give the card to you and tell you to retrieve the book," Nora grumbled, looking back to her computer screen and tapping a few keys aggressively. Percy glanced back at Annabeth, who shrugged. "Yeah, well, I appreciate it, but I do have exams to study for this week, so is there any chance this can wait until later?" Percy asked, annoyance dripping into his tone. This felt like the beginning of a quest, and he did not like it. Nora looked back up from her computer, also now annoyed that her dismissal did not take. "The book is ready now. Go up to the 4th floor and retrieve it, or it may not be ready again for some time," she snapped, standing from her desk and walking swiftly away to a cart of books that she had begun rummaging through. Anger flashed through Percy's emotions, and he found himself taking a deep breath. After calming himself down, he turned to Annabeth, who had taken the card fully from his hand and was squinting at it intensely. "Well, that was incredibly helpful. So glad they're always so insightful," Percy muttered to Annabeth. His girlfriend looked up at him, eyes shining with excitement. Oh, right, on the 4th floor. Annabeth had been dying to get up there since day 1, and he knew she would never turn down an opportunity to visit, let alone take out a book and study it. He sighed resignedly. "So, I guess we're going to the 4th floor?" he asked. "You know me too well," Annabeth laughed. "Besides, even if it is Garley related, I have a feeling this may be a gift from your father. I'm fairly sure this is written in Atlantean," Annabeth said, turning her attention to the card again. Percy frowned, also reading the card again. Yep, just as he thought. The card was still written in plain English. Wise girl, I hate to break it to you, but your dyslexia is worse than mine. That is by far the easiest English I've ever read," Percy teased, now grinning up at his girlfriend. Annabeth's eyes shot upwards as she made eye contact with him again, curiosity lighting up her face. "Percy, does this look like English to you?" she asked quickly, turning the card back over to face him. Percy nodded slowly. "Yes, does it not to you?" he asked quietly, squinting closely at the card. Annabeth grinned, turning the card over to read it herself once again. "Not even a little," she laughed. Fourth floor?" Fourth floor, she said. Percy grumbled, pulling his backpack up over his shoulders again. Annabeth moved at a much faster pace towards the stairs, practically taking them 2 at a time. Percy couldn't help but smile at her excitement. At the very least, she was happy for a moment. It still felt like the beginning of a problem for him. Why else would a mysterious entity leave a card for a book that only he could read? He shook off his doubts, however, as they climbed the final flights of stairs. A nymph attendant, dressed in a nearly identical outfit as Nora, but with a red cardigan rather than gray, looked up from the book on her desk as they approached. The desk the nymph sat at was smaller, with a few cabinets behind it and a computer monitor on the desk. The entire small room that they had entered was lit by Greek fire torches that bathed the room in a greenish glow. It gave Percy the creeps. Directly next to the nymph's desk was a set of doors that seemed to be ever-changing. One moment they looked like the doors of Olympus, the next from the gates of Hades. Finally, as Percy settled his gaze on it, the doors shifted. Now made of dark-colored stone, 2 stone mermen settled next to either side, armed with tridents. Pearls lined the edges of the door that glowed softly with light. Percy's mouth fell open slightly. It was a perfect copy of the doors to the newly rebuilt throne room in Atlantis. He had seen them only a few times, but they were unmistakable. Annabeth gasped softly next to him, eyes widening at the sight. "They're exactly like you said they were," she said softly, not taking her eyes from the intricate details carved in the stone guards. The nymph shut her book softly with a quiet humph, and began frantically typing something into her computer. Percy startled slightly, forgetting she was there for a moment. Hi," Percy said, moving slowly with Annabeth in tow, who was still staring at the doors eagerly. "Nora said to come get a book someone reserved for me?" he asked. The nymph nodded, looking up from her computer screen. "Yes, Perseus Jackson and Annabeth Chase. You've permission to enter and return with 1 book. Any more than that one that was offered to you, and you may be punished for stealing without permission. Do you accept the loan?" Percy narrowed his eyes at the nymph, noticing her name tag said Carol. Did all the nymphs have grandma names? Percy wondered. He shook his head and sighed. "Yeah, sure, I accept, or whatever," Percy muttered. Annabeth kicked him lightly and glared at him. "Thanks," he added half-heartedly. Carol nodded and clicked a few more keys in silence. Percy shifted his weight. He really did need to study. Was this going to take long? He started to open his mouth and ask, however Carol suddenly stood, grabbing a set of keys from her desk and moving towards the doors. Carol then slid the key into the lock and pushed the doors open, revealing a seemingly endless room lit by glowing pearls. Bookshelves spiraled in all directions, tables and benches made of stone spaced intermittently through the shelves, with seaweed growing freely and flowing in a current. With a jolt, Percy realized that the entire room was filled with water that was being held back behind an invisible force field where the doors met the room they were currently standing in. Carol grunted. "Haven't seen it take this form in a while." Annabeth shot forwards, looking eagerly over the rows of books. "Does it change depending on what the person is seeking?" she asked excitedly, looking over at Carol, who shook her head. "In a way, yes, but it changes to present each royal library takes, depending on the god or goddess you are borrowing a book from. Lord Poseidon does not often let those not of his kin. You both have permission to enter. Your card will demonstrate where to find the book." As if in response to Carol's statement, the card shot from Annabeth's hand directly into the room, waiting just past the threshold for them. "You may read from any book present, but you must get permission to remove any others," Carol finished, walking back towards her desk and reopening her book. "How would we get permission?" Annabeth asked eagerly, practically bouncing. Percy almost groaned. His bag was about to be incredibly full of their long trek back to the on-campus apartment they'd got permission to live in instead of the dorms. Tartarus did make for extenuating circumstances after all. Well, usually you have to submit a request. Carol frowned up at them, shifting her glasses back on her nose. However, since you're being accompanied by a prince of the sea, it is likely you can pray to him and he will hear it, Carol replied, pointedly going back to her book. Annabeth opened her mouth with more questions, but then snapped back shut, looking towards Percy. You think I'll drown if I go in? She asked quickly. Percy blinked. He hadn't even thought about it. Something in him, one of those little gut feelings he was getting more and more these days in regards to what abilities he may possess, said that she would not be able to drown in that water, and to be safe, he always could make a bubble for her to maneuver around in. He'd gotten increasingly good at maintaining them for longer periods of time. I don't think so. We've got a safety net bubble if need be, he replied, shaking his head. Annabeth gave him a look that read, You're sure? He smiled at her in a way that said, yes, he was, before grabbing her hand and stepping through. He took a deep breath upon entering the water. It was cool, but not cold, and was pure salt water. He turned back to Annabeth, who was holding her breath. Percy started to panic, wondering if he had somehow been wrong and Annabeth was drowning. But thankfully, she gasped suddenly, breathing normally and not choking. Oh, that is so weird, she exclaimed, blinking rapidly. Relief washed over Percy as he laughed. Yeah, it was weird for me too at first. When I fell into the Mississippi at the arch, I had to force myself to inhale. He recalled. Annabeth looked past him at the card that was circling figure eights rapidly in the water. I think the card wants us to hurry up, Annabeth giggled, pulling their still joined hands along in the water. Percy quickly guided the currents around them to push them along easily, and moved swiftly ahead of Annabeth. She stopped her efforts in swimming and simply allowed herself to be pulled through the rows of books by Percy, who was steadfastly watching the card zip away in front of him. Did it have to move so damn fast? Finally, though, it zipped to the right and came to a near-instant halt directly in front of a row of shelves. As Percy caught up to it, it moved slower this time towards the middle of the aisle. Percy let go of the currents and walked behind it, Annabeth letting go of his hand to lean down and read titles of things. Some of this is in ancient Greek, so I could actually read it. Maybe some of these others you can translate for me? She rattled out. Percy rolled his eyes fondly and kept following the card. Annabeth finally standing to follow. The card stopped in front of a large book bound in kelp. Percy glanced at the spine, reading the same inscription that was on the card. Atlantean History, A Beginner's Guide, he read. Annabeth pulled it slowly from the bookshelf and turned it over. Is that really what it's called? She laughed. Percy nodded, also smiling at the somewhat silly title, considering it was an ancient-looking book bound in kelp bindings with pearl inlaying the lettering on the front. A single image in metallic gold was inscribed on the front of a shivering trident. Percy lay a hand on it, and something hummed in his gut, warning him from the inside. Whoa. What? Annabeth asked, looking up at him, and he explained as he took the book from her, opening to the first page. It was a large illustration of Atlantis, but it looked different to him, newer somehow. Not like how it had been rebuilt, but like the palace itself was younger. It's beautiful, Annabeth said softly. Percy smiled and nodded. Yeah, I really gotta ask Dad if you can come sometime, he said. That would be amazing, but I doubt he would ever want a child of Athena there, Annabeth said, somewhat wistfully. Athena used to be a regular visitor at Atlantis when she learned and sparred with my granddaughter Pallas. She may no longer be welcome there, but I hold no grudge if her children wish to visit with mine. A voice said from further up the aisle, causing both demigods to jump and reach briefly for their respective weapons. The god of the sea stood at the end of the aisle, near the main path. Poseidon was in his usual Hawaiian shirt and Bermuda shorts, brown flip-flops on his feet. He smiled warmly at both of them. Annabeth bowed her head. Good afternoon, Lord Poseidon. I can't say we were expecting anyone else in here, she said. She means to say you scared the shit out of us, Dad, Percy said exasperatedly. But still, he smiled happily at his father. It was always good to see him now. They had discussed and worked through a lot of their issues before, and with less rules restricting godly interaction, he had been able to see him more regularly. Poseidon shrugged sheepishly. Apologies, then. It was not my intention. He smiled again at them, gesturing towards the book. I hope that book will be somewhat interesting. It was your sister's idea. The Lord of Horses laughed softly. Wrote? Percy guessed, chuckling. Obviously. She did make a good point. You did not get to grow up in Atlantis, and I know you enjoy spending time there. I thought a bit of history may interest you. It also has some history from a few of your lesser-known demigod siblings there. Many of my children were great heroes that were not spoken of in favor of something else going on. No time for myths to be written to them, as history had moved on. Child of Athena wrote this book long ago. You two are far from the first from our lines to fall in love, and he was fascinated with the history of the lesser understood and forgotten. He wrote He wrote for all of the Olympians later down the line, I believe, but I only have copies of the one he wrote about Atlantis. Poseidon explained, grinning as their relationship was mentioned, and Percy and Annabeth both blushed scarlet. Wow, thanks, Dad. That's actually pretty cool, Percy remarked, looking back down on the book. You have to translate that for me. I need to know everything, Annabeth said quickly, looking up seriously at him. Poseidon laughed, and a copy appeared in Annabeth's hand in ancient Greek. There, should be easier for you to read, the god said, smiling as Annabeth thanked him. Well, I do need to be getting off for a moment. You two stay as long as you'd like. You've my permission to take anything that is not locked, but if it has a lock on it, please wait and ask me first. Some of them are cursed or dangerous books I keep hidden away from the regular eye. Percy's dad said, summoning his trident to his side. Percy and Annabeth nodded. I'll see you on Sunday, Percy. Triton has made a new warm-up routine, and I'm sure you'll be thrilled with. Percy groaned, and Poseidon chuckled and disappeared into a swarm of bubbles. Annabeth laughed at Percy's dismay and began hunting through the shelves for books in Greek. They spent the remaining portion of the afternoon not studying as they should have been, and instead reading in the library. Percy found an Atlantean sword-fighting book that also mentioned how to use a trident in combat, and had been reading it for a good hour before realizing how long they had been there. He blinked. Since when could he stand to read for an hour? Maybe it's because it's the language of the sea, Annabeth suggested later when he brought it up. He had made it through the history of Atlantis being built and the beginning of his father's reign. He had also read the story of Triton, Rhoda, Kim, and Ben. Percy still struggled saying Beth the Sakai and had gotten her permission to shorten it. Being born and coming into power. It was well written and favorable to the gods being written about. It is accurate to how you describe them, Annabeth had said, and Percy agreed. I'm just getting the parts about your demigod siblings, Annabeth said, looking up from her book. Percy was still finishing the final godly side of things by reading about his father's Triton and how it was forged. He looked at her. What, gonna spoil history for me? He teased. Annabeth scoffed, rolling her eyes at him before sitting up again. Listen, while Poseidon himself had many demigods, their stories are more muted. The few that are spoken of are his most famous sons. It is true, Poseidon had more demigod sons than daughters. It is believed by Atlantis that his daughters are born in the times of need. Rhoda was born on the cusp of a revolt against Zeus. Her wise counsel allowed things to resolve peacefully. Chemipolia was born with a violent storm shortly after war broke out among Atlantean colonies, and she commanded armies to yield to her might. It is believed, too, that his demigod daughters are more rare because they are born in times of need. This is a few of their stories, and the stories of their lesser-known brothers born to mortal women. Annabeth recited, looking up at Percy in surprise. Percy had not known that, but he did think back to the stories told of his demigod siblings at camp. They spoke of Theseus, Orion, and more, but he could not recall one story about his Greek sisters. He knew some of his older demigod sisters and brothers later in years, such as the world wars and other times in history, but never about his ancient Greek sisters. Huh. Well, that feels very sexist, Percy questioned. How was he never learned these before? Maybe at camp this summer we can teach the Apollo campers to tell these stories, and ask the other gods if they can give us a book like this that my brother wrote. I could start by asking my mother. Hermes and Apollo would probably be willing, Annabeth wondered. Percy smiled at her. I think that would be great. The other kids deserve to know the stories of their siblings, too. It's like learning about your old family stories. Percy laughed. Annabeth smiled, a plan in her mind. And that was Chapter 1 of The Coral Palace. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'm really glad to finally be getting to this. It is very good. In later chapters, there are whole portions written in, there are whole, sentences and stuff written in Greek. So, either I might pause and, go to Google Translate or something, because honestly, that's the best I have, is Google Translate. And, to see how to pronounce it in Greek, or at least try to. Or I might just pronounce, I might just end up pronouncing it, how I think, based on how the letters look, that it would probably be pronounced, but I will be so wrong. So, either I end up butchering it horribly, or I end up butchering it horribly. So, yeah, that'll be the Greek for later. Yeah, I hope you all enjoyed. Sorry it took me so long to get to this. It took me a while to read it, because it's a long one. And then it took me a while to get to it because I was doing other podfics. But I'm finally getting it. I'm finally getting to it. And These chapters will probably always be posted earlier in the day because they are longer chapters. Like for I'll Be Home with Frayed Feathers, like the length I'm at now in this recording would be 2 chapters, but it was only 1 for this one, so I will almost certainly be going chapter by chapter unless one is really short. But I know that later on they do get really long. Like, it would take me like an hour to read it by myself, like 1 chapter. So I know that they do get really long. So I'll probably be doing the recordings and posting earlier in the day just to make sure I can get them out. And I think that's all. So hope you all have a good night or day wherever you are. Hope you all enjoyed. And bye.